Hey, my name is Jeff. In today's video, we're going to go through how to fetch events in NDK using both the fetchEvent method and also subscriptions, and talk about the differences between the two and why you might want to use one or the other. So let's get started. We're going to be using the same Nostr Start app that I used in the first video I made about the basics of building with NDK on Nostr. I've made a few small changes, nothing major, but I will point those out to you very quickly so you don't get lost in the changeover. So the first thing I did was I went ahead and added a layout file. Layouts in Svelte are a way to just simply wrap the pages that you are going to render and put some common code in those, exactly as they sound. The other one, for those who know Tailwind, you'll notice this very quickly. The other thing that I did is that I added Tailwind to the project so I could give it a little bit of basic styling and make it look a little bit nicer. So that's pretty much the only difference. So we'll go ahead and get rid of this, and I'll get rid of the sidebar so we can really focus back on the page we were working on before. And from that previous video, if you haven't gone and seen it, please go back and look at it right now because it'll probably be helpful. But from that previous app, or from our previous starting point, we had an app that allows you to sign in with a NIPO7 signer. We did talk a little bit about how to fetch user data, user profile data. We talked about how to grab some events a little bit. Let me just very quickly run through what we've got here in the code, and then I'll show you how that signer works, and then we'll start in with fetchEvent. So right now we are declaring a new NDK instance. We are waiting for the browser to come online and then connect that NDK instance. You can see here we just log console as soon as log to the console as soon as we're connected, so that we know it happens. And then we've got this one login function which creates a signer and then uses that signer, which usually is something like Albi, to get permission from the user to access their details. Once that happens, we are going to display the user profile. And this is what we worked on last time, was basically figuring out how to show that user profile. So let me just show you how that works over here. You can see we're already connected. If I click login with Nostr, Albi's going to pop up. If I say confirm, then we're going to see that a NDK user object comes back here on the console, and we have a nice card here that renders a bit of my profile information. So this isn't persisting anything anywhere. So if I refresh the page, you'll see that that disappears and we don't have the user anymore. But it's a really good way to just go ahead and kind of practice, or at least see how, okay, we've gone from logging in, getting the npub of the user that just logged in, and then showing that information on the page. Now, let's go ahead and talk about events. There are two ways with NDK to fetch events. And obviously in Nostr, everything is an event. Your profile is an event. The kind1 notes that you send around are events, but also zaps are events. And there's actually two separate types of events that coordinate amongst themselves to make sure that a zap actually happens properly. So there's all these different types of events. And so you end up using fetchEvent or subscribe very often when you're building Nostr apps, because that's the only way you can get back data. It's sort of like calling to a database in a more traditional web app. So let's talk first about the fetchEvent method. And what I'm going to do here, and I'll show you why I'm going to do it in a second, but we're just going to make a function here called, let's see, fetchEvent from ID. And this method is going to be very simple. The reason I'm putting it into a method here is because we're going to call it in this kind of then callback from the connection. We need to make sure that we have connected NDK before we make a fetchEvent call, or else it'll just fail silently. And so the best way to do that, or the simplest way to do that for our purposes here, is just to stuff that in the callback here and make sure that it happens. So we'll go ahead and I'll put it in here as a commented out line, but you'll see where we're going to go with this in a second. So let's say that we've got a note ID, and I'll copy one here because I've got it handy. And this is a Betch32 formatted note ID. So you can see it starts with note and then is formatted into this 32-byte string. What we want to do then is say NDK fetchEvent. And we can actually just pass that string in. So we can just say note ID. And this is a brand new addition in the latest version of NDK. So if you haven't updated NDK since the last video, you're going to have to go ahead and do that via npm or yarn or something before you'll actually be able to see this method work this way. But I think it's a really, really good addition, and something that makes just grabbing events based on IDs a lot easier. So now that we've passed fetchEvent, I'll show you very quickly what this is going to come back with. It's going to come back with a promise. And that promise, if it finds an event with that ID, it's going to be an NDK event. If it finds nothing, it's just going to come back with null. One important kind of caveat here is that fetchEvent will come back with the very first event returned. So if you are connecting like we are to several relays, you will get back whoever returns the first event for that kind or for that ID. So same as before, since we've got a promise here, we're just going to be lazy about it. We're going to create a then statement and do what we want to do in the callback. So let's just go ahead first and console log this so that we can see that it is actually working. We've got this method here. We still have this commented out, so let's uncomment that. And so what's going to happen here is when I save this, the page is going to hot refresh because we're in a development environment, and it's going to immediately, as soon as it's connected, call this fetchEvent from ID method. And what we should see, and we did see, is that we got another connected console log, and then we immediately get the NDK event dumped out here in the console. So that's kind of boring. So let's do this. I'll grab a bit of code here that I prepared beforehand, and we'll put that on the page so that we can actually see it. And you can see here that this is looking for an event object, which we haven't handled quite yet, but we'll get there. It's putting it into a little bit of a styled div, and all we're doing is grabbing the content out. There's a bunch of other fields here like kind and ID and all sorts of other stuff, but really all we care about is the content for this demo. So what we do need to do is we need to set a variable to handle that. And so what we want to do is come in here and we'll say let event. That is a type of NDK event. And instead of just console logging here, we'll leave that, but we'll set the event. And you know what? Let's call this fetched event so that we don't have any weird overlap. I think it'll do the right thing, but just in case. Okay. So you can see that this is coming back as an NDK event, and we're going to tell, this is complaining because it's saying event or null is not assignable to NDK event. So what we probably want to do is just say that this could be null, and that'll fix that error. And you can see here that since I saved that, it's already popped up on the page. We're getting the same content that shows up down here, but it's just totally unstyled. This is the raw content from the event. This has an image in it that usually you would want to handle better and render as an actual image. There are, if you look closely in the code on the console, you can see that there's a few line breaks here that we're not handling at all. This is actually one of the slightly harder things about dealing with Nostr events, is that the content that comes back can be quite complicated. And being able to accurately render the content, render embedded notes, render mentions, render images or videos or GIFs or whatever it is, that can get a bit tricky, but we're not going to go there for today. So as you can tell, this fetched one event, came back, didn't keep open a connection to any of the relays, just grabbed the event and shut everything down. This is great, and this is really kind of the major difference between fetchEvent and subscribe. FetchEvent, or fetchEvents when you want to grab multiple, is great when you're looking for a distinct set of events. A set of very specific kind one events, say, or if you're looking for someone's follow list, you might want to use fetchEvent and get the kind 3 list for that user. This is not good when you're trying to render data that shows up in real time. So, the feed on Snort or, Primal, that's not something you would want to use fetchEvent or fetchEvents for, because once that fetches those events, it closes the connection and that's it, and no new events are going to show up. That's the exact use case for subscribe. So let's go ahead and we'll do this. We'll go ahead and just comment this one out so that we don't continue to call that one. Same as before, let's just create a really simple method called fetchEvents from sub. We will come up here and say fetchEvents from sub. Oh. And then comment that out until we're ready. And there's a few different distinct things that you need to do when you are working with subscriptions. One is to just set the subscription up in the first place. So that is very straightforward. We use ndk.subscribe, and then we pass it a filter. And we didn't cover this with fetchEvent this time. I think we went over it a little bit in the last video, but you can pass either a Betch32 formatted ID here, or you can pass a filter. And actually, why not, like, while we're here, let's go ahead and do that. And there's actually a good reason for that, because this will show you what can happen if you get this wrong. So we've got in a filter, we can pass IDs, we can pass kinds. Let's go ahead and put kinds in here, because I do know that this is a kind one event. In IDs, I'm going to do this, and I don't know if anybody's going to be able to notice what's going to break here, but this will not work, and we'll talk about why in just one second. Okay, let's get rid of that. Make sure we're not in that space. We need to give this a comma so that we don't have actual just total errors. And then we can see here that we have an issue. We're getting kind of a complete error with what's happening here. And the reason is this is not expecting fetch32 IDs. It's expecting hex IDs. And so what we need to do is we need to convert this from that type of ID into, a note hex ID. And the way you do that is by using Nostr tools, which NDK kind of comes bundled with, to decode that note that's been encoded in fetch32 format. So we want to pass it the note ID. And just so that we're clear on what that looks like when that gets decoded, I will just console log that. And then we can have a quick look at it. Oh, interesting. Very interesting. Oh, okay. Random stray import variable. Love those. So now we need to uncomment this fetch event from ID so that we've got this method going again. And we've turned off the actual fetching of the event because we were wanting to have a quick look at what this hex ID, the decoded hex ID, looks like. And in fact, it's not a good idea to actually call it hex ID because that's not what it is. Let's call it decoded. And so you can see here that the decoded object comes back with a type and a data field. Each of these, unfortunately, comes back with a slightly different data structure. So if you pass this an inpub, it's going to decode in a similar way to the note ID. So it'll come back with inpub and then data. But if you pass it an inattr or an in event, it comes back slightly differently and has a bit more data in terms of it'll have a relays object and a few other things. So when you're decoding from events like this, you need to kind of be careful that you're handling the right object type, or you're at least looking for the right, property of that object when you go to use it. So now that we know that we are actually after this data field, we can go ahead and get rid of this console log. We can uncomment all of this. And then we can now pass decoded.data. And now when we run that, it'll do exactly as it did before. Instead of fetching it based on the note ID, we've actually now given it a much more complicated filter object, or a slightly more complicated filter object that allows us to specify lots of other things. And so if we were wanting to limit this in some other way, when you're using IDs, you usually aren't going to do this. But if we wanted to say authors and give, my inpub, but we need to decode that inpub, this is how you would do it. Okay, so now that we've done that, we've talked about the difference there between encoded IDs, fetch32 IDs, and decoded IDs like this, the hex IDs. Let's go ahead and we'll just go ahead and comment that out again. And we'll start back on our subscribe method. So now that we understand how filters work, let's go ahead and just say that we want kinds, and we want all kind1 events. This is the actual fire hose. It's going to give us everything, so we'll be excited to see what comes up. Now, like I said before, when you're using subscriptions, you actually have to handle a few different things. So we need to create the subscription first off and tell it what we want to subscribe to, which is what the filter is about. Then we need to handle things when it starts to come back from the subscription. And those are events that are emitted. And so we use the sub on method, the subscription on method. And there are several different types of events that we can subscribe to. The one that you obviously want to subscribe to is the event calls. That means, hey, an event has come back. And that, as you can imagine, comes back with a callback that passes you the event that just was received. In this case, we're just going to console log it to make this easy. We won't get into doing too much with the actual rendering of these for the moment. So that's the first thing that you probably want to handle well. The other thing that you're going to absolutely want to handle well is called EOSE, and that means end of stream, basically. It means that the data from the relay is finished and it doesn't have any more data to give you. So this generally happens at the end of, when a relay finishes giving you everything it's got, it will send an EOSE, and that's a signal to the subscription that it should just automatically close. Now, NDK takes a bit of an opinionated stance here. It defaults to closing subscriptions as soon as it sees one of these EOSE methods. And so again, whichever relay sends one back, first is the one that's going to end up closing the subscription. In our case, again, let's go ahead and just console log, and we'll just say EOSE in big letters so we can see it. And the last thing we want to do is we want to handle what's called notice. And notices it's a good practice to handle notices because the notice itself will usually happens when you are being rate limited or there's an error of some kind on the relay's end. And so if you're maybe asking for something that it doesn't have, it might come back with a notice. If it is telling you specifically, hey, you're sending too many calls, we're rate limiting you, that's often the first type of notice you'll end up seeing. So handling those notices is pretty important. Even if you're just console logging them or throwing an error or something like that, it's a good idea to just put them in there. So we'll just put notice. I don't expect that we're going to see one today, but we'll go ahead and handle it there. So now we have our fetch event from sub. We're using a filter to just grab all kind one events from all users. And then we are specifically telling the subscription what we want to do in the case of these three different events that come back. Okay, so now that we've got that done, let's go ahead and uncomment this. As soon as I save this again, this is going to reload the page. I'll go ahead and get rid of that console so that we can see what's going on. And what we should see is events start to come pouring in. And I'll make this a little bit bigger so we can see it a bit better. But you can see what happened here. Like I was saying before, we got a lot of events, and then an EOSE showed up. And as soon as that happened, the subscription was closed. And so we can wait all day for the next hour. We're not going to see any new events here because NDK has said when we see an EOSE, we're going to close. If that's not the behavior you want, and in this case, since we're looking at kind one events for all users, this is, as you can imagine, this is a global feed. This is probably not what we want. So what we have the ability to do is to say close on EOSE, false. And this says keep it open. Let it run. And as you can see, as soon as I save it, it's going to start pouring in all those NDK events again. We hit an EOSE right there, but you can see it's continuing to bring in new NDK events as they happen. So as users are creating new events, these are popping up immediately in our feed here. So you can see that you by default aren't going to get all these new events, which I think is a great thing. I think that's a smart way of NDK trying to help clients stay a little bit nicer to relays, use them a little bit better. But in the cases where you need to, you can keep a subscription open, and you can keep it open for quite a long time. Like these will run for a very long time. And it's very simple to decide, very explicitly what you want to have happen in all of these different cases. Okay, I think that's about it. I think we've covered a little bit about how to fetch events, how to use both normal Betch32 IDs, but also filters to do so, and then how to open subscriptions and keep those subscriptions open. Hopefully this has been helpful. Let me know if it's been great. If it's not, if you have any other questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll be back with another video soon. Have a great weekend.